Thank you, Professor Rubenstein, for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. This is the first time actually that Bensi and I are filming separately. He is in his hotel room traveling, and we just didn't want to miss this opportunity to speak to you again. We've gotten such great feedback. Bensi can tell you more about our feedback from the first episode. So, Bensi, why don't you address the professor?
So we got tremendous feedback, and people loved everything that we were saying about Agadah. The only thing that I felt was missing, and that people might have felt was missing, is to actually go through it in detail inside and see it. Whereas our first podcast was more general, this podcast, which is really like the first podcast that we did with you, it's really to get to this point where we actually take the ideas that we generalized in the first podcast and bring it into fruition now, and to really go through an Agadah the proper way, the structure, to analyze it, to break it down, to everything that the professor will be doing for us today, and we're really appreciative of it because this is going to be fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you for having me, and I'm delighted to be on the podcast or YouTube again. So yeah, we will be dealing with the Agadah of Elisha ben Abuyah. That was what Ben and Benji asked me to discuss, which I've written about in my book, Talmudic Stories and elsewhere. And of course, Elisha ben Abuyah and the story of Elisha ben Abuyah is one of the most interesting, one of the most problematic in some ways, one of the most popular stories about the rabbis, at least in modern times. It's also a very challenging one to start with because it's complicated, it's long, and it's got various different and contradictory tendencies within it. But it's always good to start high, and we can always do other podcasts about more straightforward or simple stories. Agadot. So Elisha ben Abuyah, as I mentioned, and I'm sure everybody knows, has become increasingly very, very popular today. And part of this is due to Milton Steinberg's As a Driven Leaf, which is a modern reconstruction or retelling, a full-length book of Elisha ben Abuyah and his life. I mean, it's fictional, but based on the Talmudic stories. But many people have read this book and enjoyed it and developed a big interest in Elisha. Actually, Elisha ben Abuyah became a topic of great interest since the Jewish Enlightenment, when I think many of the maskilim, the Jews who were adopting modern Western ways and getting a secular education and so on, saw themselves connected to Elisha in certain ways, a little bit alienated from rabbinic tradition, a little bit outside of rabbinic tradition, maybe 1 foot in rabbinic tradition and 1 foot outside. And many of them wrote about Elisha and kind of interpreted him, in light of their experience, which is kind of what Milton Steinberg did too. So Elisha has been, thought about and discussed, and there are many, many theories about what actually happened and who he was, and how he became Aḥer, right, the other, this horrible apostate or heretic, so much so that the rabbis couldn't even say his name. So this is a very, very long and complicated chapter in Jewish literature and Jewish tradition, Talmudic tradition. But what we're going to do today is start with the beginning. That is the earliest sources about Elisha ben Abuyah. And these sources appear in the Mishna and the Tosefta, that is in the text we call Tannaitic, from the period of the Tanaim, that is up to about 200 CE, when the Mishnah was edited, maybe the Tosefta a little later, but these are before the Talmud. And then, so there's some sources that talk about Elisha in the Mishnah, in the Tosefta related to the Mishnah, and these sources then get interpreted both in the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, and in the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, to start the process of the stories about Elisha that become more fully developed there. So we'll look at those today, and then we'll have to leave to another podcast, another time, the full story in the Yerushalmi and in the Bavli, because these are very highly developed and long stories. So it's very rich material. But first, in order to even understand these early traditions about Elisha ben Abuyah, we have to understand a form of mysticism that was practiced in rabbinic times, in Talmudic times, before the Middle Ages, when a new form of mysticism, Kabbalah, or where we have in the Zohar, kind of took over and supplanted or superseded these earlier forms of mysticism. So I don't know if you've had on your podcast other scholars talking about mysticism and the Zohar and Kabbalah.
Very
Maybe
much
not.
so. Very much so, and we are going to have a lot more. So our audience by now is familiar with
Okay.
the original mysticism, which is the Maaseh Merkavah mysticism.
Okay, good.
So yeah, you don't have to really. You can maybe give a brief about it, but it's part of your
Yeah,
presentation.
so I'll give just a little bit about it, because as you mentioned, right before Kabbalah, there was an earlier kind of Jewish mysticism known as Merkavah mysticism or Hechalot mysticism. So Merkavah refers to the chariot, and this chariot it comes to us, or we hear about it first in the vision of Yechezkel, of the prophet Ezekiel, in chapters 1 through 3. Yechezkel has this unbelievable vision where the skies open and God riding his chariot throne, appears to Yechezkel. And he describes this throne, or tries to describe it. It's a little hard to figure out exactly what he's talking about, but there's radiant, and there's colors, and there's fire, there's a figure of a human, and he's on a chariot that is perched on angels or some kind of beings with heads. It's not clear if it's 4 different beings on each side or 4 beings total, heads of a human, an eagle, a ox, and a lion. These are the 4 kingly beasts, the king of the birds, so the king of the birds, the king of the beasts, and the king of the wild animals. So all of these symbolize really kingship. So the vision of Yechezkel was understood to be how God existed up in heaven. That is, usually God was up in the heavenly temple, but he came down and appeared to Yechezkel on his throne. And this throne that Yechezkel saw was in this heavenly temple, which was known as the Heichal. So that's why it's simply called Heichalot. It was not just one temple. Sometimes they were understood to be 7 temples, or 7 entrances or chambers, really, within one another, where God on his throne was on the innermost one. And the goal of the mystic was to have this visionary experience of God. So with some sort of out of body experience, the soul could leave the body, go up to heaven in some way, go through these Heichalot to the innermost chamber, and there get the vision of God on his throne. So I brought a little, I found some pictures of this. You can find these on Google Images, just because it's sometimes hard to, understand exactly what this entails.
And for those who are listening on the audio version, I recommend switching over to the YouTube to view the actual slideshow that Professor is going to be sharing with us right now.
Yeah. So here's just a couple of pictures of, this was one from the Renaissance painter Raphael in 1518 of that's supposed to be God, on this throne, which is carried by beasts. That's the Merkavah. There's another one who understood the vision in slightly different terms, where again you could see angels drawing this throne, and there's God in a kind of human form there. Still another vision like of this. Again, there's some angelic beings there. This one's a little more modern, obviously, but has I think I like the colors. He describes colors and radiance. And I couldn't find really any images of Heichalot except for this book. This is on the cover of a book about prayer and about Heichalot mysticism. But there, I think you get a sense of there are chambers within chambers. That's kind of a heavenly temple. And in the innermost temple is that Merkavah, is the throne. So the goal of the mystic is to go and get this vision. And, what he would accomplish there is, first of all, just this amazing, consummately unbelievable vision of God on his throne. What could be a greater spiritual experience than that? But also, the mystic was able to ask God for things. You and I, we're down here on earth, we're sitting in shul, we're praying. Maybe God hears our prayers, maybe not. But if you're right before that throne, up in the heavenly temple, I mean, there's a very good chance God is going to answer you. So it wasn't just the sense that you wanted this incredible vision. It was that you also had this ability to actually ask for something, end the suffering of the Jewish people or something like that. Now, the part of this Merkavah mysticism also included many angels, because there were angels who, in some of the texts, guard these different chambers and kind of prevent unworthy people of getting access to the Merkavah or the throne room. So you required a whole lot of knowledge, esoteric knowledge, mystical knowledge of the names of angels or what you had to say or what you couldn't say to get through these angelic guards that were sometimes hostile to human beings. This is also a kind of motif that runs through Halakha mysticism. And we find this actually very common in rabbinic sources in a sort of different way. But there's a sort of competition between angels and humans as to who's better and who God loves more. And the angels can even be sometimes hostile to humans, a little less so in the Talmud, but a little more so in the Halakha mysticism. So there were dangers involved in this quest. Dangers in terms of the angels, punishing you, even killing you. And also there were, like with many kinds of mysticism or esoteric knowledge, there was considered like dangers to the person who was trying to learn this. If you weren't sufficiently grounded in your faith, and if you didn't know, rabbinic tradition sufficiently, you might come to the wrong conclusions, and you might think some heretical kind of thoughts. We know this from the Zohar and mysticism, Kabbalah, later Kabbalah. You shouldn't engage in this until you're 40, until you're mature, until you're a rabbi or something like that. So, this was part of this esoteric tradition that the rabbis were kind of worried about that shouldn't be accessible to everybody. So this is kind of the background, because I think this is, the way the rabbis in the earliest sources, the Talmudic sources, understood what had happened to Elisha. Although what we're going to see is that there's a long development within rabbinic tradition itself, within the Talmud itself, where later Talmudic sources or later Talmudic rabbis perhaps didn't even understand these earlier sources, and they themselves were trying to make sense of what the real story of Elisha was and really interpret it in different ways. So with that kind of background, I think we should turn to the sources themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to go to the sources. We're going to start with the Mishnah, which is really the basis for the Tosefta, where we get our first mention of Elisha. Okay. All right. You guys see that? Does that look good?
Perfect.
Okay. I got to get to the next slide. Okay. All right. So here we have the Mishnah, and you can see that this is Mishnah Chagiga 2:1, and this Mishnah deals with these esoteric or dangerous subjects that the rabbis thought should not be taught in public and maybe should be limited, to those who were at a higher spiritual level. So you can see it starts out, I'll just read in English for those of you who want to follow in the Hebrew, we'll look at it occasionally. One may not expound the topic of forbidden sexual relations before 3 or more individuals. We won't get into exactly why for now. But you can see this is something that has, shouldn't be publicized or done in public, a limit of 3, nor the act of creation between 2 or more individuals. So how God created the world, again, was considered, this kind of very, very complicated theological topic that shouldn't really be taught to, just anybody or in a public setting, because it raised all sorts of questions. And then we get, nor may one expound by oneself the divine chariot, the Merkavah, unless he is wise and understands most matters on his own. Okay? So this talks actually about expounding the divine chariot, meaning studying the portion of the Bible that talks about the chariot, but it doesn't talk actually about a kind of mystical experience itself, unless, learning about it is itself by definition mystical. But nevertheless, you can see the rabbis in this Mishnah are very cautious about this kind of knowledge being disseminated. One it shouldn't even be taught to another person, but one great rabbi or one rabbi is able to do this if he's able to understand it himself. So there's something considered, you can see there's kind of dangers about looking into this mystical subject that the rabbis were very cautious about, people doing by themselves. They didn't even want to teach it, but they thought if you were sufficiently wise, you could kind of figure it out yourself, then that was okay. So this is all we get in the Mishnah, and you can see Elisha ben Abuyah is not even mentioned, nor is any sage. But in the Tosefta, and just to remind everybody, we all know what the Tosefta is, right? The Tosefta is the supplement to the Mishnah, which is structured along the same lines as the Mishnah. So for every tractate of Mishnah, almost, you have a tractate of Tosefta. And a lot of this material was material that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who edited the Mishnah, decided to leave out. For whatever reason, he thought it wasn't sufficiently authoritative or important, or he just didn't have room. But much of it was collected in this parallel text, the Tosefta, maybe edited just a little later, but it has the same sages as appear in the Mishnah. So we consider it Talmudic from that same pre-Talmudic time, up to about 200 CE, when the Mishnah was edited. So in the Tosefta, you can see this is Tosefta Chagiga, so it's the parallel tractate, right? That it goes along with the Mishnah. We get a slightly different version of this mystical enterprise, this Merkavah or Hechalot mysticism. So it starts out, 4 entered the orchard, 4 entered the Pardes. The word for orchard is Pardes. Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Aḥer, the other, that is Elisha, and Rabbi Akiva. Now, this is clearly a parable, because when you talk about esoteric subjects that you don't want everybody to understand, and we just saw in the Mishnah, they didn't really want to talk about it, you talk about it in parables, but of course that makes it very difficult for the audience if you don't have any kind of direct, tradition from the person who made the parables to understand what they're talking about. So we're not even clear exactly what this means, but the orchard seems to be a parable for mystical speculation, for this kind of Merkavah or Hechalot mysticism. So 4 entered the orchard seems to be these 4 rabbis engaged in this Merkavah activity or this Hechalot activity. They tried to get to that chariot, to the throne up in heaven, and get through those angels and through those chambers and get there. But as we see in the next section, it didn't go so well, at least not for everyone. One gazed and died. One gazed and was harmed. One gazed and cut the shoots. And one went up in peace and went down in peace. So you can see for the first 2 of them, Ben Azai and Ben Zoma, the Mishnah will go on to tell us, or this Tosefta, will go on and tell us a little bit, what happened to Ben Azai and Ben Zoma. I skipped over it here just because, that's not our main focus. But, things went bad for them. One died, one was harmed. And then one gazed and cut the shoots, and the Tosefta tells us Elisha gazed and cut the shoots. That was Elisha ben Abuyah. And then one went up in peace and went down in peace. That's Rabbi Akiva. And again, the Tosefta goes on to tell us a little bit more about Rabbi Akiva. Now, what does this all mean is we're not totally sure. But you can see a little bit even from section B there, where it says one gazed. So what is the gaze? The gaze seems to be this attempt to get a vision of God on the Merkavah. This was, as some people call it, a visionary type of mysticism, seeing the Merkavah, seeing God on his throne. So for the 3 of them, it seems like what this parable is talking about is indeed this kind of Merkavah mysticism, where they tried to get up and see the throne. And maybe at least the 2 of them who were harmed, one died and was harmed, were struck down by these angels there. What does it mean to gaze and cut the shoots? Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. And then again, Rabbi Akiva went up in peace and went down in peace. So there it doesn't mention gaze, but it mentions going up and down. And that would be consistent with Merkavah mysticism. He went up through the Hechalot to the Merkavah, the throne itself, and then he came back down and he came out in peace. Rabbi Akiva was successful. But we can see it was very, very dangerous, and this was, at least in the rabbi's eyes, this was one of the reasons they wanted to limit its audience and not even really tell us about what is going on. Now, cutting the shoots is very unclear, but of course, this is part of the parable that we don't fully understand. It seems that it's what Elisha did, again, that, the best guess of scholars, simply based on this context, is if you think about an orchard and cutting down shoots, cutting down plants, perhaps what the Tosefta means is that this orchard, the orchard, was God's orchard or was a king's orchard. This is the allegory. Orchard was, or Pardes was, the special gardens or orchard of a Persian king. That's where the word comes to us from. And these were his private area. It's where the king relaxed or where the king went. It wasn't for everybody. And it was surrounded by plants or trees or a fence or something like that to keep it private. So it's possible what Elisha did, his sin in this earliest source, was he cut down those plants that made the orchard private. It made this mystical vision private, right? If God is the king and the orchard is somehow his realm up there, or how to get access to it, Elisha tried, in other words, to open it up to other people. He cut down the shoots protecting or enclosing this orchard. And that's what he did was wrong. But again, exactly what that means, we don't know. It's, he tried to publicize it. He tried to teach it to other people. He tried to teach it to people who were unworthy. He talked about it. Not 100% clear. And I keep emphasizing that because, as we'll see, the rabbis of the Talmud didn't really understand this any better than we did. And they did their best to make sense of it. But the way they made sense of it, might not be exactly what it meant in its original tradition, in this tradition, in the Tosefta, because it is told in a kind of parable. Now, we do get one other piece of information about Elisha, and this is that the Tosefta adds a biblical verse. So it's in section D, you can see it says, Scripture says about him, let not your mouth lead your flesh to sin, and do not say before the malach. Now, we know the malach can either be an angel or a messenger. So I guess we can take it for angel for now. Do not say before the angel that it was an error, else God may be angered by your talk and destroy the work of your hands. So the Tosefta is saying is this verse somehow captures what Elisha did wrong. But the problem is this verse is very opaque. Do you guys understand this verse? What does this mean? How does your mouth lead your flesh to sin? And don't say that before the malach that it's an error or God may be angered. There's a little tension here between starting with the malach and then shifting to God. In the Hebrew, al tomar lifnei hamalach, and then lama yitzofa Elohi. So what is this angel doing? And what is it that causes God to be angry? And what is destroying the work of the hands? So this verse, there definitely seems to be something done that's wrong, but it doesn't really help us that much understand what Elisha did wrong or what the Tosefta thinks he did wrong, because it's such a difficult verse. The pshat of this verse, if you look at biblical commentators, is probably about something about vows. That is, not taking a vow and then violating it. So how does your mouth lead your flesh to sin? You take a vow, I'm never going to eat meat again. And then if you eat meat, you've violated your vow. So you've sinned, and maybe that's your flesh is sinning in some way. And you shouldn't then, at that point, you can't plead to the angel that you made this vow in error because you've taken God's name in this vow and God will be angry and punish you. That's probably sort of close to the pshat, but clearly that's not what the Tosefta means here in this context. but we don't really know what the Tosefta means, except you can see a little bit about this malach, this angel, which and this angel and God being angry and making some sort of anger, making some sort of error, that does sound like part of the dangers that are warned about in these hechalot, in these Merkavah texts, that the angels might punish you, you might get hurt by angels, you might get destroyed. But again, it's very, very, very inscrutable. And, so what I want us to understand just before we go on is that when the Talmudic sages in the Yerushalmi and in the Bavli came to try to make sense of this tradition and understand what happened to Elisha, I think they were just as puzzled as we are today. In other words, they did not have some sort of direct oral tradition about what actually happened to Elisha. And they were left like we are to try to make sense of the Tosefta. They knew that kind of background. They knew a little bit about Merkavah mysticism, Hechalot mysticism, at least some of the rabbis, but exactly what the Tosefta is talking about, they didn't know. Okay? So, the point is that, there's a sort of sense, I think, in the popular imagination, and people who have sometimes read Milton Steinberg and read other books about Elisha, is like, we know exactly what happened to Elisha, and, we have these biographical traditions about him. But in the earlier sources, this is all we have. And the biographical traditions we're going to get to now are really just attempts to make sense of this early tradition. Okay, that makes sense? Okay, it'll make a little more sense as we get to it. All right?
Makes a lot of sense.
Huh? A lot of sense. Okay. All right, so let's move then to the Yerushalmi and see what the Yerushalmi says. Okay, so the Yerushalmi, as we know, is a commentary to the Mishnah, and it follows the same order and structure as the Mishnah. So for Mishnah Tractate Chagiga, we have Yerushalmi Tractate Chagiga, and many times in the Yerushalmi, the Tosefta, which also follows the Mishnah, is quoted in the Yerushalmi. So here in Yerushalmi Chagiga, in the same chapter, we get the quotation of the Tosefta, and then we get the Yerushalmi's attempt to understand it. Okay, so you can see what I've put in yellow at the top layer there, the top row. Aḥer gazed and cut the shoots. That's just this quote from Tosefta Chagiga, right? Well, we have in the Tosefta, Elisha gazed and cut the shoots, but it starts out with "For entered the orchard," talking about Elisha and Aḥer. There's actually some variation in the manuscripts of the Tosefta about using the term Aḥer and Elisha, but clearly they're used interchangeable there. So the Tosefta says Aḥer, gazed and cuts the shoots, basically quoting the Tosefta. And now the Yerushalmi tells us, ostensibly what seems to be some other traditions about Elisha, but I'm going to claim they're simply attempts to understand the Tosefta. They're not really independent of it. So what do we have? The Yerushalmi says, who is Aḥer? Elisha ben Abuyah, who would kill the young students of Torah. Now pause for a second, audience, and tell me, how is the Yerushalmi understanding the Tosefta? How is one, this first section in the Yerushalmi understanding that first yellow row, lowercase a in the Tosefta?
Cut the shoots being young students of Torah. Cutting the shoots would be essentially killing the shoots.
Exactly. So, what is so heinous that Aḥer did, that Elisha did, that, the rabbis couldn't even mention his name and they had to call it the other? Well, obviously it's not cutting, real plants. What's wrong with that? And, the cutting the shoots is clearly a parable. So how do we decode the parable? So as you very astutely realized, cutting is understood as killing, and shoots, young plants, young growth, is understood as killing young students of Torah. So, in some of the stories, the retellings of the Talmudic tradition about Elisha, he does these terrible things, but this is really just the Yerushalmi attempting to understand the Tosefta.
My
and
only
really
problem,
just that line of Tosefta.
so
is it the correct understanding? I don't know. I don't think so. I think the correct understanding is probably more in terms of sort of a mystical enterprise, but this is how the Yerushalmi takes. Yeah.
So, and I think you're saying that because it's hard to understand in the context of the Pardes how killing young Torah students has anything to do with, gazing and having that experience leading. How do they connect? I'm not so sure. And I think that's
Exactly.
kind of what you're trying to say.
If the Pardes is referring to some sort of Merkavah or Hechalot mystical enterprise, everything we understand about what that involved, it had nothing to do with other people or killing people or young students. It had to do with out-of-body experience of your soul, up into these heavenly realms. So it's the Yerushalmi, it seems to me, either it kind of understood, but it didn't want us to understand. That is, it didn't want its audience to know anything about that mystical background, because the Yerushalmi was trying to move away from it or suppress it, essentially, or the scholars of the Yerushalmi just didn't even understand it. That's possible too. But they give us this interpretation, and then you can see in the next row, capital letter B, they said he would kill every student whom he saw distinguish himself in Torah. So that's very similar to the previous row, and it doesn't add much, but it does add every student whom he saw. Why is it important to say every student whom he saw?
It gives a connection. It gives a connection back to the gaze.
Exactly. So the Tosefta says he gazed and cut the shoots. So the Yerushalmi, I think, is making two sort of similar tries to interpret that. The first basically just interprets cut the shoots. He would kill the young students of Torah. And the second says he saw these young students distinguish themselves, I guess shoot being a good plant, and therefore a good student of Torah, and then he would kill them, cut them down. So it's a second attempt to understand the Tosefta, to take into more data that there's a gaze and cut the shoot. Okay, so these two are different versions of Yerushalmi interpretation number one, or Yerushalmi story number one. Now, Yerushalmi goes on to give what it presents as an addition, like he did something else, but is really another kind of interpretation of the Tosefta. So look at number two there. Not only that, but he would go to the meeting place, the school or the Beit Midrash. The Yerushalmi calls this a Beit Va'ada or Beit Va'ada, what the Bavli sometimes calls a Beit Midrash. So he would go to this meeting place, he would go to the school and see children in front of their rabbi, of their teacher, and he would say, what are these sitting and doing here? This one's profession is a builder. This one's profession is a carpenter. This one's profession is a hunter. That one's profession is a tailor. In other words, they shouldn't be learning Torah. They should be engaging in these kind of careers, preparing for these kind of careers. When they heard this, they would leave him and go away. Now, I think this also goes back to the Tosefta, that line up above that we saw, Aḥer gazed and cut the shoots. You can see, first of all, is that he would go to the meeting house and see children. So again, we have this seeing, that's interpreting Aḥer gaze. And the shoots, again, are children. But in this version, how is cut the shoots, cut being understood? It's not that he would kill the students, but he would cut them off, right? Cut them off from Torah, or cut them off from tradition. So cut the shoots in two is he would cut off the children from learning Torah.
I'm wondering if the fact that he's saying something would go with the last part.
Exactly. Oh my God, Benji, you are the model student. You already are catching on. So with this story, the Yerushalmi begins to take into account the other datum that it has from the Tosefta, which is the verse. And that's why it quotes the verse right here, and the other yellow, about him scripture says, let not your mouth lead you into sin. So how does the Yerushalmi understand this verse in relation to Elisha? His mouth led him into sin by convincing these young students to abandon their Torah. And that was something that he said, and it was clearly very, very sinful. So that's why the Yerushalmi, sort of splits up the Tosefta like it did. It quotes the first line of it, then it gives us story 1, it then gives us story 2, and then it gets to the second part of the Tosefta to tell us that story 2 has now begun to incorporate both gazing and cutting the shoots and the mouth leading into sin. So this kind of weird scenario, again, comes from an interpretation of the Tosefta, a different one. The Yerushalmi presents these as cumulative. He did number 1. Not only that, he also did number 2. But again, I think we can understand these as 2 kind of independent attempts to understand the Tosefta. Okay, everybody with me so far? That
Yes,
clear?
absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, now the Yerushalmi continues. I couldn't fit it all in one slide, but you can see this is the continuation, just starting again with that verse that we just read. And the Yerushalmi continues, for he destroys the works of that man. This is an interpretation of the last few words of the Tosefta. You see the verse ends, the verse quoted in the Tosefta, God may be angered by your talk and destroy the work of your hands. So the Yerushalmi says he destroyed the work of he destroyed the works of that man, or the works of the hands of that man, I should have translated it. Maaseh yadav shelo toha'ish. In other words, he destroyed his own works of his hands. That man, the Talmud often talks about a person in the third person, when it means the first person. So in other words, he destroyed his own works. Now, how did Elisha ben Abuyah destroy his own work? So the work of his hands. Work of your hands is an idiom. It appears pretty often in the Torah and very often in rabbinic literature following its presence in the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh. And it can mean different things. One thing it can mean is children, actually. The works of our hands are our children. I mean, that's what we make as adults and as parents. So it's possible it refers that the Yerushalmi is saying here, trying to understand the verse in terms of that scenario, that he destroyed these children, cut them off from Torah. But another meaning of works of one's hands is mitzvot. The commandments, the good deeds that we do are the work of our hands. Maaseh yadenu, maaseh yadai, maaseh yadav, maaseh yadecha. So at least that's the way the rabbis often understand when the Bible talks about maaseh yadav. So, in other words, it seems like the Yerushalmi is understanding this part of the verse, saying that Elisha, by this heinous act, by getting all these students to leave Torah, abandon Torah, he destroyed the mitzvot that were to his credit. He lost the merit of those mitzvot. Or, again, maybe it's a double entendre. It also means he destroyed the children or cut the children off from Torah. That is the work of his hands or our hands. The work of people's hands is their children. So, it's a little bit of an awkward attempt, but I think, again, the Yerushalmi is doing its best to understand why the Tosefta quotes this verse in relation to Elisha and what that might mean. But the Yerushalmi doesn't quite, at least yet, deal with the rest of the verse. I mean, there's an angel or a malach, that it was an error and God being angered by your talk. I mean, we don't quite see that interpreted yet. But the Yerushalmi could be doing the best that it could. Maybe not. Maybe it's not that every part of the verse is relevant. So that's all part of story 2, right? So we've got 2 attempts to understand Elisha. One just taking into account the phrase "gazed and cut the shoots," and one, that is the second one, taking into account that phrase as well as 2 parts of the verse, right? The mouth leading him into sin and destroying the work of his hands. But now we get a third story in the Yerushalmi. This is a little more lengthy, right? So it says, also when there was a persecution, they made the Jews carry burdens. But the Jews arranged to have two people carry one burden on account of the rule that two who perform one labor on the Sabbath are not culpable. All right, so again, the Yerushalmi is imagining a situation where someone is persecuting the Jews. Let's say it's the Romans. I mean, we don't know because the Yerushalmi doesn't tell us. And they're forcing Jews to violate Shabbat. They're forcing Jews to carry things on Shabbat. As we know, you're not allowed to carry from a private domain to a public domain, or a public domain to a private domain, or 4 cubits in a public domain. But the Jews are trying to outsmart these persecutors by having two people carry their load, whatever they're supposed to carry. Because if two people carry something, they don't violate Shabbat, at least not according to D'oraita law, the law of the Torah. Right? To do that, you have to carry something, you have to perform a Shabbat labor individually, by yourself. And then what happened? Elisha said, make them carry individually. So the persecutors, went and made the Jews carry individually.
So he's almost like he's basically turning his back on his people, and he's going to the powers that be and saying, oh, if you really want to make them, if you really want to get at them, this is what you have to do: make them carried individually. So it's kind of like he's a traitor.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the Yerushalmi is portraying him, like you say, as a traitor, as someone who's presumably apostatized, renounced his religion, certainly renounced his people, gone over to be some advisor for the Romans, presumably, or some persecutors, and telling them really how to, make the Jews violate their own laws. It's a terrible, terrible thing. So the story goes on. We'll finish the story, then we'll come back to talk about it. But they arranged to set the burdens down in a Carmelite in order that they not carry out from a private domain to a public domain. So if you know Shabbat law, a Carmelite is a kind of intermediate domain. It's neither public nor fully private. It's like a courtyard, And again, you don't violate Shabbat law d'oraita, at least according to the Torah, if you carry from a private domain to a Carmelite, or a Carmelite to a private or public domain. It's only from a private domain to a public domain, or 4 cubits in a public domain. So again, the Jews were trying to outsmart the persecutors, or at least avoid the worst kinds of religious violations. Because after all, would the persecutors know about this, sort of detailed law about Shabbat boundaries and domains and so on? But then what happened? Elisha said, make them carry flasks. So flasks are made out of glass. The Romans had kinds of glass or something very brittle. And they went and carried flasks. And the trouble with the flask is it probably couldn't be set down in a Carmelite. So in other words, again, Elisha told the Romans how to get the Jews to violate Shabbat by, in the most extreme way, by making this loophole impossible. They couldn't set down flasks because the flasks would break, so they had to carry them from the private to the public domain. So again, Elisha, is this advisor, this traitor, this collaborator, working with the persecutors. Now, it's a kind of odd scenario. You must, we'd have to think, so where does the Yerushalmi get this? Again, it seems to be making this up, but why does it make up this scenario? How does this interpret the Tosefta or the verse? Well, again, it's kind of the mouth leading to sin.
Yeah.
Right? How does the
mouth lead to sin by telling them to carry the flasks?
Exactly. So the mouth leads to sin. Elisha's mouth, providing counsel to the persecutors, leads the other Jews to sin, because they have to violate Shabbat, and it leads him to sin, of course, by forcing others to violate Shabbat. So it lives up to that part of the verse. And again, destroy the work of your hands. I think, again, this is can be understood in terms of destroying mitzvot, that is, forcing the Jews to break mitzvot, not observe Shabbat. Maybe Elisha losing merit for his mitzvot, if work of your hands can refer to mitzvot. But again, there's probably a double meaning here because the flasks would break if they were set down. So again, it could be the destroying the work of your hands or breaking the work of your hands could be, the Yerushalmi could be trying to understand that in terms of the breaking of the flasks. It could have both meanings, because it's a very odd kind of scenario to otherwise for the Yerushalmi to come up with if it wasn't trying really, I think, to understand how those words would apply. Okay, so the Yerushalmi gives us, 3 stories, right? I mean, killing the students, not only that, but advising them to leave their studies, and then this collaborating with the persecutors that it presents as he did this, and he did this, and he did that. But I think it's 3 attempts to understand the Tosefta. If you look carefully, the first one just interprets the first phrase in the Tosefta, gazed and cut the shoots, right? Killing the students or seeing and killing the students. The second scenario interprets both that phrase, gazed and cut the shoots, the students abandoning Torah, as well as your mouth leading you to sin, because he told them to leave. And I think this third one just interprets the verse. It does not really go back to the Tosefta, gazed and cut the shoots. This third scenario about the Jews carrying burdens is just your mouth leading you to sin and destroying the work of your hands. So the Yerushalmi is, it's very brilliant here. It's very aesthetically pleasing in a certain sense. It's making 3 attempts based on the 2 data that you have in the Tosefta, gazed and cut the shoots, and then the verse. The first just the gazed and cut the shoots, the second both, the third just the verse. The Yerushalmi saying, I'm doing my best here, working with the different components I have, and this is what I come up with.
It's almost like, in a sense, and maybe there's a slight pun here, but it's almost like up until now, I know that it's going to get into Metatron now, we're going to get into that, but
yeah,
it seems like up until now, it's almost like they're demystifying it, or just putting it into a what's the word? It's kind of like just putting it into a context which fits, for their audience in a way.
Yeah, that's funny. Judaism demystified. It's actually perfect for your title, because this could be seen as a kind of demystification, or suppressing whatever mystical element there was in the Tosefta. Yeah. And making it into something else. Yeah, making it something that maybe resonated more with their audience. They had some experience with persecution, or they had some experience with I don't know, about people killing young students of Torah. I don't know. That would seem pretty extreme. But I think the point I think we should come away with is that the Yerushalmi generates these very, very negative portrayals of Elisha, not because it has biographical information, not because it's got some ancient tradition about what he did,
but interpretive.
It's trying to interpret the Tosefta. And in a way, you can see this as a kind of midrash. So remember, what a midrash, a rabbinic midrash, will interpret a verse in the Torah, and very often not according to what we would call as the pshat, or it'll make sense of it in different ways. And especially the rabbinic kind of retellings of the biblical stories. What happened with Cain and Abel, and Cain and Hevel, and how they came to, murder each other, or what happened with Abraham on the way to the Akedah. Any of these rabbinic stories about biblical characters, these midrashim, interpret what you have in the Bible in these different ways to generate new narratives, to generate new stories. And it's very unusual for rabbinic stories to be generated out of earlier rabbinic traditions as opposed to biblical tradition. But I think this is an example of it here. It's a kind of midrash on a rabbinic source, not on a biblical source. But it comes to the same thing, telling us a new story about the characters. Okay, so that's the Yerushalmi, but what's going to happen in later Jewish tradition is that people will start thinking this is what Elisha did. He killed young students of Torah. He collaborated with the Romans, and we get these kind of later traditions about trying to reconstruct what Elisha did, how he came to this. But I think that's a little misguided because the Yerushalmi itself is just teasing out these scenarios to make sense of the Tosefta.
And it's obviously not saying that he literally killed them, but he's like cutting them off.
Well, in the first scenario, he did kill them. In story one, he would kill students of Torah.
Yeah, in the second story, it's kind of walking it back a little bit, but he's not literally killing the students. He's just becoming a traitor and leading them astray.
Yeah, it's a different attempt to understand the Tosefta source, kind of less terrible.
Yes. Right. So meaning they're interpreting. It's not a matter of literal or not literal here. It's a matter of how are they going to interpret the words that they're trying to interpret.
Yes. How are they going to make sense out of that?
That's what they're doing.
Yeah. Exactly. All right. So let's go to the Bavli. Good. We did the Yerushalmi. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. You guys with me?
Yeah, we're
with you.
Okay. So here's the Bavli. So again, the Bavli appears in Tractate Chagigah of the Bavli. It's also in the section of Talmud that interprets that Mishnah that we saw in the Mishnah about the Merkavah mysticism. And we get a story about, it quotes the Tosefta, Aḥer gazed and cut the shoots. And then it continues as follows. So what did he see? Right? What did Elisha see? Because what did the Tosefta say? He gazed, right? Now, there are some manuscripts of the Talmud that don't say what did he see. Some of them actually just says what is this or what is Elisha. But and if you open your kind of printed text, the Vilna Shas, it has, what was this or my he, as opposed to my chazah. What was he or what is he, as opposed to what he saw. But I think this is the better reading. That is, the Babylonian Talmud is asking here, what does the Tosefta mean when it said Elisha gazed? What did he see? Okay, so now it tells us this story. He saw Metatron. So Metatron is the name of an angel that we know from various sources. He saw Metatron, to whom was given permission 1 hour each day to sit and write the merits of Israel. He said, it is taught that on high there is no standing and no sitting and no jealousy and no rivalry, and no back, and no weariness. Perhaps, heaven forbid, there are two divine powers. Immediately they brought out Metatron and struck him with 60 lashes of fire. They said to him, when you saw him, why did you not rise before him? Okay, this line I've put in angled brackets because it doesn't appear in all manuscripts, so they think the better reading has it. So they said to Metatron, when you saw Elisha, why did you not rise before him? He was given permission to burn the merits of Aḥer. Metatron was. Destroy the merits of Aḥer. A heavenly voice went out and said to him, return rebellious children, except for Aḥer. All right, so this is, again, a very tricky story. Let's try to understand it. What did he see? What did Elisha see? So
he saw a heavenly scribe sitting, which you're not supposed to be sitting if you are not God.
That's right. So first of all, I think the first thing we should observe is the Bavli presents this in more of a mystical way, a little more consistent with Hechalot or Merkavah mysticism. Because as we said, what that kind of mysticism entailed was a heavenly journey, an out-of-body experience up to the heavenly realms where you saw these angels and you got to God's throne. So as opposed to the Yerushalmi, the Bavli is more consistent with understanding it as a kind of mysticism. So the Bavli assumes, or is telling us, that when he got up to heaven there, he saw this angel who was, his function was, like you said, as a scribe to record the merits, the zchuyot, right, of Israel, of the Jews, so that on Yom Kippur, for the nation as a whole, we would have these merits to our credit. But Elisha got confused. He had some other tradition that up on high in heaven, There's no standing or sitting, no jealousy, no rivalry, no back. Back refers to the backs of angels. According to some traditions, the angels have heads on all sides, or they're kind of face to face, so you never see a back. There's no weariness. They never tire out. But in this tradition that he got from somewhere else, it says there's no sitting. And Metatron is sitting. So Elisha reasons that an angel can't be sitting, because on high, no standing, no sitting, no jealousy means the angels can't do this. So Metatron must be also divine, must be a divine figure. Perhaps, heaven forbid, they're two divine powers. And, I think the Bavli here is sensitive also to what the rabbis felt was a potential problem with mysticism, with this kind of esoteric inquiry into the heavenly realms, is you might be led astray. You might get some, come to some incorrect conclusion.
The interesting, from what I see here is that I've read some scholars also saying that this is potentially a cautionary tale about Gnosticism or dualism, some type of, maybe even Christianity, where he kind of sees this lesser Yud-Ke Vav-Ke in as some Kabbalists described, and came to a conclusion that there are other forces other than God. So
yes, I think you're 100% right. I mean, that's potentially in the background. There was this kind of religious movement that as you say, known as Gnosticism, which sometimes entailed, there were various kinds of Gnosticism, but a belief that there was a kind of higher God and a lower God, but there were two divine powers, like it says here, Shtei Rishiyoten. Sometimes this is a good God and a bad God. This kind of dualism is, of course, a good way to understand why this world is evil and why they're suffering. We know in Babylonia, the Zoroastrians were dualists, so there's a lot of background here. But it could be that kind of Gnosticism or mysticism, and the rabbis are kind of saying that's the danger. That is one of the dangers if you engage in this kind of mysticism. You might be led astray by those heresies.
As an interesting footnote, there's we see kind of modern day, Bentsy's smiling because he knows where I'm going with this, but we see kind of the modern day view of mysticism, the Kabbalah of today, kind of leads people to the same, in a way, it could lead people to the same conclusion. Not everybody, but that there are different kind of expressions of the Godhead. And
so Kabbalah, that's why I say Kabbalah is different than Hechalot or Merkavah mysticism. Kabbalah understands God in terms of 10 sfirot. But those, sfirot also do have these kind of different powers or potencies. So it's not quite the same as dualism or two divine powers, but it's
beyond
got similar problems, let's say.
Beyond the sfirot, there's also there's the Atzmut, and then there's the Ein Sof, and you're right.
Right, which is for the same reason that it's considered mystical and esoteric and shouldn't be engaged in by everybody, right? In any case, so let's go back to our story. So Elisha says maybe they're two divine powers. So what do? They brought out Metatron and they whipped him with lashes of fire. So this proves to Elisha they're not two divine powers, right? This was the way of convincing him, demonstrating to him that Metatron's just an angel. He's not a god, because he can be punished like any sub-divine figure. And then this line, they said to him, when you saw him, why did you not rise before him? This kind of blames Metatron a little bit. It was also a little bit Metatron's fault, because Metatron should have stood up and not let Elisha get the wrong impression. So you could have that line or you could not have the line. But in any case, Elisha caused Metatron to be punished, to suffer, in order to prove that they were not two divine powers, because he had articulated that very, very dangerous belief. Now, once Metatron is punished, he was given permission to burn the merits of Aḥer. So this is kind of a midah keneged midah, a measure for measure punishment. Elisha caused Metatron to be punished, so Metatron gets to take revenge and punish Aḥer. Metatron was struck with lashes of fire, so he gets to burn out Aḥer's merits in return. And again, that seems to be his function, right? He's the scribe who is writing the merits of Israel. So here he gets to erase or destroy the merits of Aḥer, of Elisha, this one Jew, you know. Mm. And once he's done that, Elisha loses all reward for mitzvot. Right? He's lost all credit for mitzvot. And therefore what? You know, he can never get to heaven. You know, he's consigned to, you know, whether the rabbis think you're going to go to Gehenna or hell or just to be destroyed, you know, he's not going to get to Olam Haba. And not only that, a heavenly voice went out and said to him, return rebellious children, except Aḥer. Right? It's a quote from a verse in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah, Shuvu banim shovavim. Everybody can do tshuva, right? We know all Jews can do tshuva. We're supposed to do tshuva every year on Yom Kippur, every day. And that's how you get rid of sin. But if Elisha can't do tshuva, he's stuck. He's got no merits. And he can't do tshuva for his sins. So at the end of the day, he's going to be a Rasha. And there's no way for him to escape that fate. No way for him to get to Olam Haba.
He has no incentive to improve because
that's right. So the story is going to continue with him doing evil and so on. We'll get to that in a minute, because after all, he's got no he's got no options. He's got no reason to be good. He's got no reason to be do mitzvot anymore, because they're all burnt out and he can't do tshuva. And we'll just look at the next scene of the story because it's important for understanding the Tosefta too. And then we'll go back to the Tosefta. So the story of the Bavli continues. He said, that is, Elisha said, since that man, that is, since I, again, the third for the first person, since that man has been banished from that world, I will go and enjoy myself in this world. I've got no way to get to Olam Haba, no merits, no ability to do tshuva, so why should I do mitzvot? Why should I be good in this world? I'll go be a hedonist. You know, I might as well. And Aḥer went out to evil ways, literally evil growth. Tarbut ra'ah. I think it's important it uses this term. It's not the most common term. But why would it be evil growth? Going back to the Tosefta.
Yeah, is this part of the shoots?
Yeah, so this is going back to the shoots. We'll get
okay.
He went out to evil growths, evil ways. In modern Hebrew, the word tarbut means culture, but in rabbinic Hebrew, it means, it means growth. So he went out to evil growth. He found a certain prostitute. He propositioned her. She said to him, "Are you not Elisha ben Abuyah, whose name went out throughout the world? Aren't you the famous sage, Elisha ben Abuyah? Everybody's heard of this great sage. Why are you propositioning me, a prostitute?" He uprooted a radish on the Sabbath and gave it to her.
Uproot? Is the uproot thing maybe another kind of? Could be
another cutting the shoots.
Another cutting the shoots, or like a little, yeah, okay.
Yep. And then she said, it's another, right? It is Aḥer. It can't be Elisha ben Abuyah, because Elisha ben Abuyah would not violate Shabbat if you uproot a plant, right? It's a kind of gardening. It's forbidden on the Sabbath. So he proves to her that it's not Elisha. And then she says, oh, it's another Aḥer. So here we get a kind of etiology, an origin of the name Aḥer. How did he get the name Aḥer? This prostitute said, "Oh, you're another person. You're not Elisha ben Abuyah." So that's how he got the sobriquet, or the nickname of Aḥer.
So, Professor, when you look at this, it's so interesting. We have here two interpretations. We have the interpretations of the Yerushalmi. We have the interpretations of the Bavli. Completely different.
Completely different, because
there's nothing that you can compare them. It's meaning like completely two different distinct directions.
Yeah, you're right. Because neither of them really understood the Tosefta, and so they did the best they could to make sense of it, and they went in certain directions. We will see a little later when we do the other podcast about the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. There is something in common between the two. They did have a kind of shared tradition, but not really in this section. Okay. But so you make a good observation. It's like two different midrashim, right? You can interpret a biblical verse.
So it's interesting to me that when people want to take these for what it's worth historically, it becomes like what do you, so because the Bavli was more popularized, so the Bavli version kind of got popularized, so then that's what happened. And but if you look in the Yerushalmi, it's not at all what happened, but that's okay because it just never gained as much popularity. I mean, that's really where how it's ended up.
And you also mentioned in the previous podcast we did with you about the different girsaot, and we're not supposed to look at these things historically because you see that each version is trying to teach like a different lesson. We should learn all of them and try to understand what they're all trying to tell us. Because, for example, the Bavli will use the backdrop of like a Beit Midrash where it wasn't originally, because that was their culture. Right. So I think that's important to point out.
100%. In other words, any rabbinic stories about Rabbi Akiva, rabbinic stories about Rabbi Meir, all those rabbinic traditions, as we explained before, are not meant to be historical or biographical. They're closer to what we would call didactic fiction, with the asterisk that fiction, history, biography, and antiquity did not exist in exactly the same way that we conceptualize them today.
Correct.
But so any rabbinic story, even the ones about Rabbi Akiva, should not be understood historically, biographically, but, kal v'chomer this one, because these ones, we see exactly where they come from. And they come from interpretation of an earlier source. The others, some of the other ones, we don't know exactly where they come from. Sometimes we can see
here we see clearly that there's a Tosefta.
Yeah.
Here we see clearly there's a Tosefta, and we see clearly that the Bavli and the Yerushalmi are trying to interpret over here. It's clear as day. I understand. So
if there is any historical or biographical kernel, it's in the Tosefta. But even that we should understand is probably a later tradition and meant to tell a lesson about this kind of mystical speculation. Even the Tosefta is far removed from the original Elisha. We just have no idea. But certainly, 100% the Bavli and Yerushalmi.
Elisha ben Abuyah is basically the archetype for teaching this. It's a tool to teach a specific lesson about apostasy or heresy.
Exactly. And actually, we'll see the Bavli is going to use it really for teaching a different lesson, and the Yerushalmi for teaching different lessons. But it does exactly become a tool.
In the Tosefta, right? Benji's words would hold for the Tosefta.
Well, the Tosefta does teach that there's a danger in mystical speculation, but again, it doesn't tell us really that much about what it really is.
But once you get into the Bavli and like what comes, like all the stories that start following, it goes in a completely different direction. It's not even discussing mysticism. It's right. It's going to start posing completely different questions.
Exactly. Yeah. We'll get to that. Let's just look again. I want to make one thing clear. We'll get back to that other slide. But so in other words, we can see how the Bavli interprets the Tosefta if you look at these two columns, right? So the Tosefta says Elisha gazed and cut the shoots. So in the Bavli, what is the gaze? Well, and it opens, what did he see? He saw Metatron. Cut the shoots, as you guys already correctly figured out, the Bavli understands as went out to evil ways or growth, went out to evil growth, and then uprooted the radish. Those are both attempts to interpret the Tosefta as cutting the shoots. How did his mouth lead him into sin? He said, perhaps there are two powers, right? He voiced or articulated this heretical dualistic speculation. So that was a mouth articulating a theological sin, you might say. The angel or malach in the verse is clearly Metatron. We didn't get that in the Yerushalmi. The Bavli is doing a better job, if you ask me, of interpreting all the data that it has in the Tosefta. Do not say before the malach that it was an error. I think that's being interpreted as, do not repent. In other words, you, Aḥer, cannot say, oh, I made a mistake, let me do tshuva. No, you can't repent. God being angered in the verse is Metatron being punished. He was angry at Metatron. Or I guess you could say angry at Elisha too. By his talk, again, the talk is the mouth leading him into sin. Perhaps there are two powers, and destroy the work of your hands. As we said, Maseh yadecha, Maseh yadav, work of your hands. often refers to mitzvot, or the merit of mitzvot. So how did the work of Elisha's hands get destroyed? His merits, his skuyot, the mitzvot he did, were destroyed by Metatron. So almost everything in the Tosefta and the verse from Kohelet that is quoted gets interpreted in the Bavli to create this kind of scenario. The Bavli really does a great job here, I have to say.
May I say that you're mentioning that the Bavli does a better job. I'm wondering if there's an intuitive notion over here with the Bavli, because it's talking more to the point of the Tosefta, which is the mystical experience, which is right. That I think that's why you're saying it's doing a better job.
Yeah.
So
better job because it's consistent with that mystical background, and also because it takes into account more of the verse and the Tosefta.
Right. The Yerushalmi, what it did with the verse is really out there. I hear you. Yeah.
The Yerushalmi took into account parts of the verse, but we'll look at that in a minute. But dropped the stuff about Metatron or an angel. No angel appeared in the Yerushalmi.
So I'm wondering because in general, as a whole, the Yerushalmi tends to be, again, pun intended, I guess, but sort of demystified as opposed to the Bavli. The Yerushalmi doesn't talk about demons much. The Yerushalmi doesn't seem interested so much in mystical speculation as much as the Bavli, which you'll see a lot of shadim, you'll see a lot of angels. So I'm wondering if kind of like the character of the Babylonian, of the Bavli, and the character of the Yerushalmi contributed to their way of interpreting.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, it's very possible. I think this notion that the Yerushalmi doesn't have as many angels and demons as the Bavli might be a little exaggerated. There's definitely less in the Yerushalmi, but the Yerushalmi is a shorter text. I think this goes back to the scholar Louis Ginsburg, who was trying, in a famous essay, to explain differences between the Bavli and Yerushalmi. There are a lot of demons that appear in the Yerushalmi. Maybe they're more in the Bavli because Babylonia, in Zoroastrianism and Persian, Iranian culture, they thought more about demons, but there's definitely in the Yerushalmi. Everybody in antiquity believed in demons and angels.
Right.
It might be there's less of the mystical speculation in the Yerushalmi. It might be the Bavli continued the Hechalot traditions a little more, although I think we have texts from Eretz Yisrael about them. So it's possible what you're saying is true. I'm just not sure.
Fair. It could be I'm wrong. I'm not no expert in Yerushalmi. I've heard these ideas floating around, so I was kind of just bringing it out. But you're much more familiar than me. I'll take your word for it.
Yeah.
And one thing that's standing out to me, obviously, is it's really jumping out at me is the whole prostitute narrative.
Yeah. Well, again, that prostitute narrative is funny because it might even be a kind of comical element in it, but it's the Bavli's understanding of what someone would do who's got no motivation to be a good person. Why would you not just try to enjoy yourself, pleasure yourself, eating, drinking? Why would you observe mitzvot? Why would you observe the sexual prohibitions? So the Bavli, kind of almost logically, I mean, there's some kind of reason to this. If you think there's nothing to work for, you've got no chance of getting any sort of heavenly reward. So yeah, you might go out and be a hedonist.
So one interesting observation is that in the ancient world, especially, prostitutes were kind of like this shows that prostitutes actually knew stuff. Like here, she knows like halakha. She knows who Elisha ben Abuyah is. Why? Because people who would go visit prostitutes, they would talk, they would speak to them, they would tell them stuff.
Yeah, I think you're being a little too historical. I think this is the Bavli imagining a kind of prostitute who's knowledgeable about Jewish law, but again, it's for the purpose.
It's just funny that it's interesting that he goes to a prostitute and is having this conversation. Like he finds some prostitute, he propositioned her. Like doesn't have to do with anything. It's strange.
Yeah. Well, he propositioned her is the typical Bavli phrase for what you say to a prostitute. It's like, but the whole scene is really to provide the explanation of cutting the shoots, uprooting the radish, and then getting the name Aḥer because the prostitute thinks it's the other.
It also
Right, it's a
shows-
segue to the name.
It shows what kind of company he's keeping, meaning that's how far down he's gone, that he's with a
Yeah,
crowd.
exactly.
Okay.
All right, I want to do one other thing here. You're going to have to reorder the cut and paste. Is that okay in your editing?
It's okay.
Yeah, because I forgot to do this with the Yerushalmi. So
We can even go back. It doesn't have to be cut and paste. We'll just keep this in. It's fine.
yeah, no, yeah. So here again, so let's pretend we're just dealing with the Yerushalmi. So let's just review the Yerushalmi and illustrate how the Yerushalmi understands the Tosefta and the verse that it quotes. So again, this is to make clear just how the Yerushalmi is interpreting the Tosefta. Where the Tosefta says gaze, the Yerushalmi says you would kill every student whom he saw distinguish himself in Torah. Cutting the shoots, the Yerushalmi understands as killing the young students of Torah. I should also say cutting them off from Torah, that is telling them to abandon the Torah. Letting your mouth lead you into sin is in that third story, in the second story where he says, what are they doing here? These students should go away. And in the third story, it's where he tells the persecutors, make them carry individually to violate Shabbat, not two at a time, or make them carry flasks, which they can't set down. Now, it doesn't seem that the Yerushalmi interprets those other parts of the verse. I mean, that's okay. The Yerushalmi could have thought it was only the first part of the verse that was relevant, or the first and the last part. And then God may be angered by your talk, as above. That's him saying those things. I forgot the last line there. And destroy the work of your hands. As we said, destroying the work of your hands was destroying the mitzvot that the Jews were doing and possibly destroying the children. So again, this I think makes clear again, just in a more tabular form, that the Yerushalmi is really interpreting the Tosefta along different lines and doesn't really have independent traditions about what Elisha did.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so you could splice that in and edit it, or I guess you could leave it at the end, or you could just omit it if you don't think it's helpful at all.
Oh, it's definitely helpful. I don't think we need to.
I don't think it needs to be edited. I think we could just
Yeah.
leave it as is because it's
Okay.
part of the flow anyway.
All right, so you can see, but really both, like you said, both stories go in different ways, but they both really go back to the Tosefta. And then what we'll do in subsequent podcasts, subsequent recordings, is in one we'll have to do the Yerushalmi because it's a very long story. It'll take a while, and then in a separate one the Bavli, and then we could even think about a third one about other traditions. But much of it goes back to the Tosefta in the verse that gets spun out, midrashically almost in different ways to generate these different pseudo biographical traditions about what Elisha did.
And we're going to get into the motivations behind the way the Bavli and the Yerushalmi characterize Aḥer, right? That's going to be part of it.
Yeah, we'll get into what the Bavli and Yerushalmi want to explore, want to teach through the figure of Aḥer. I think they they go in different directions, but they use it for their own purposes because, like you said, they weren't so interested in this mystical speculation anymore. Or if they were, they weren't generating traditions for the Talmuds that really went into that in detail. They thought that should be esoteric. They thought that should be secret. And therefore, when they had these sources in Tosefta, which they had interpreted initially in those ways that we saw today, they then took it to work out different things that they were interested in, and they thought that their audience of rabbis and students would be interested in.
And that's what we're going to get into eventually. Yeah.
Eventually, yeah.
I'm very interested in the student aspect, which is Rabbi Meir, who he stays loyal to his teacher even after his apostasy, and he kind of never gives up on him, and he still learns from him, and then like Aḥer is just trying to push him away. He doesn't want him. So I find that to be interesting because cutting off the shoots doesn't really apply to Rabbi Meir. So I find that very fascinating.
Right. Well, again, yeah, that's true. That's true. In the Bavli, remember, it didn't cut the shoots in terms of killing students or cutting them up from Torah.
Yep, that
And
was
you have Rabbi
the
Meir in the
Yerushalmi.
Bavli, but you're right. In the Yerushalmi, it did take it that way, and you do have traditions of him and Rabbi Meir in the Yerushalmi too. So it didn't take it that far. Yes, that's true.
So we're really looking forward to it for all of our listeners. This is a lot to cover. It's a subject that requires hours, and we can't just put it all in one podcast, but we're looking forward to this series on Elisha ben Abuyah. It's such a fascinating topic. And we want to thank you, Professor, for coming on again. We really enjoyed talking to you as usual, and looking forward to the next podcast.
All right, great pleasure. We'll do it when we can.
I feel like I just left the shear right now. Thank you so much. This was incredible.
Yeah, my pleasure. Bye.